Hello, teachers. This lesson is video is for session 7 in our study, the second half of Genesis. It covers Genesis 32, 22 to 32. And Jacob finds himself in a very interesting situation. Um, his um, his behavior from years ago in terms of his swindling of his brother Esau is finally coming back to be a real experience for him. He knows that Esau's coming back, and so he he has to kind of experience the potential of what could happen there. And we see that in Genesis chapter 32, and we see him experience God in a really interesting way in this particular moment. And so in Genesis 32, 22 to 32, we see Jacob experiencing God in an interesting way. So he's changed by this. We see that he's fundamentally different after he has this experience with God. And so that leads to my objective statement. We are changed when we truly experience God's working in our lives like Jacob did. Here are three ways he was affected. Now, we may not wrestle with God as we're going to see Jacob do here, but in terms of seeing that as a physical thing that seems to happen. But we do experience God through His Word, through things that happen to us. And so we see that God changes us and how He does it. And we see God do that in our lives too. So this is a very relevant thing. So there's three ways that Jacob was experiencing God. Number one, he experienced God through new circumstances. And I wrote, we experience God in pivotal times. I kind of already referenced the time frame, um, in the circumstance in which Jacob finds himself. If you read in Genesis 32, verses 22 to 24, it says this. And he rose up that night and took his two wives and his two women servants and his 11 sons and passed over the ford of Jabbok. And he took them and sent them over the brook and sent over that he had. Here you see Jacob separating himself from his family, separating himself from literally all of his stuff. Literally, he sent over that he had. It's a way of saying all that he had. It's basically leaves Jacob by himself. All of his family and all of his stuff is on the other side. And he finds Jacob, verse 24, and Jacob was left alone. The point that the curriculum, that's the word I was trying to come up with. The point that the curriculum called this area is alone. These couple verses alone. They probably took that from verse 24. I'm sure they did. Jacob was left alone. Um, this is Jacob in a moment, basically coming down to he doesn't have any of his cattle, he doesn't have any of his family, he is by himself. And it says that it was at that time, here's the rest of verse 24, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. Um, Now there's an experience with God. And he says a man, but later on we'll see that he calls this man God. And that's a very, very interesting thing. The Hebrew wording indicates that this was no dream. Jacob actually wrestled with someone. The fact that this struggle lasted until dawn conveys the determination of the two guys that were wrestling. There's a ambiguity and a mystery to who this person is. Um, Later, the prophet Hosea said Jacob had wrestled with God, and in fact, just spoiler alert, he says later on, um, Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. So Peniel or Peniel means the face of God, and so this is his experience, and he's saying he's experiencing with God. Of course, a man that is God, we know that as Jesus, and there are many that would say that this would be a Christophany, a pre-incarnate um, manifestation or experience with God. Um, Interesting way of putting that. Interesting thing to think about. But here you see pivotal circumstances causing a moment where Jacob was alone and he is wrestling with God. And don't let that get lost on you. God uses often pivotal circumstances. Jacob is worried out of his mind because of his potential experience with Esau. And he kind of, in that moment, will use the term lost everything. He is without any of his resources, any of his stuff, and he's just there with God. And I've seen over and over. I was talking to a friend today, and I told him it's often been said that people don't change when they see the light; they change when they feel the heat. And God does use circumstances to bring about change in our lives. That leads to a second thing that happens. He's given a new name at the end of this wrestling. I think this is such an incredible thing, and I could talk for hours on this. But verse 25, we see this interesting wrestling continue. Verse 25, when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." This is the man that he's wrestling. "Let me go, we're at dawn." And he said, "I will not let thee go except thou bless me." So he believes that this person can bless him. And he said unto him, "What is thy name?" This is the God that he's wrestling with, the man he's wrestling with. "What is your name?" Name is Jacob. Jacob means deceiver, supplanter. Of course, why is he in the circumstance he's in? He's there because he deceived. Of course, God allowed all this to happen, but he was one who had deceived. Verse 28, and he said, "Thy name shall no more be Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed." The name Israel means wrestles with God. And that's an interesting thing. Verse 29, Jacob asked him and said, "Tell me, I pray thee, thy name." Now Jacob wants to know what's the name of the person I'm wrestling. And he said, "Wherefore is it that thou dost ask me my name? Why are you even asking me that?" It's almost like he's saying, "You know who I am." And he blessed him there. Who's he? The man that he wrestled with, who is God. So you have this new name. He goes from being deceiver, being supplanter, being Jacob, the the guy, the schemer, and he goes to being the one who wrestles with God. And literally, part of that is he's a prince. For as a prince, thou hast power with God and with men. He prevailed. Um, it will be Israel because you have struggled with God and prevailed. Interesting. Jacob stole Esau's blessing. Here he sought confirmation of God's favor moving for, forward. Israel relates with struggling or striving specifically with God. The new name indicated a change in Jacob's life, but it also described how his descendants would struggle with God throughout their history. So here you have this new name and given a new identity, and that leads to a new walk. Point number 3, new walk. We remember God by how our experiences with him affect us. You see that happen here. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel. So it's kind of interesting. He called Bethel the house of God. Here now he's calling this place Peniel, the face of God. Why? Because he saw God face to face, and my life is preserved. And as he passed over Penuel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. That touch that had happened from that wrestling, where now he walks different. He halted. He limps. He remembers. He's going to remember what God did with him, both in the new name, because he gets a new identity, and with a new walk. He's been affected. Like a scar. It's a limp, and he realizes he's been touched by God. Therefore, the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which shrank, which is upon the hollow of the thigh to this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh in the sinew, and it shrank. It was a great gift from the Lord because it reminded him of the Lord. And that happens to us. Sometimes we will remember God by how we were affected. Maybe sometimes there's a sorrow. Maybe sometimes there's a joy with a hint of gray, kind of part of it. Can you go back to certain circumstances in your life where you feel like you wrestled with God and you were affected by it? And now, we've all been given a new name when we get saved. And of course, God grows us and changes us and uses sometimes difficulties to get us closer to Him. God is interested, not exactly in our happiness. I think He does want us to have joy, but He's more interested in our holiness and changing us to be who He is. And that holiness should lead us to joy. We see this happening in Jacob's life, and it's not a whole lot different than ours. I hope this helped you. I hope this is something that you can use to make you more prepared to proclaim the Word of God to your people this week. Have a great day.